Good afternoon and welcome to the second instalment of Steer's Election Reflections series, where we're bringing together industry experts for 30-minute conversations on the impact of Labour's agenda across cities, transport and infrastructure. My name is Matthew Clark. I lead Steer's work in new mobility, which focuses on electric vehicles and infrastructure, shared mobility and emerging transport services. Thank you for joining us today for this particular conversation about what a Labour government will mean in terms of electric vehicle adoption in the UK. I'm delighted to be joined by Toby Poston, Director of Corporate Affairs for the British Vehicle Rental and Leasing Association, the BVRLA. Toby oversees the association's communications, events, policy, campaigning and research activities. Prior to joining the BVRLA 15 years ago, Toby spent more than a decade as a business journalist, including 6 years as a reporter and editor at the BBC Economics Unit. Welcome, Toby.
Hi there, Matthew. Lovely to be here.
You'll be able to find a recording of this session and other sessions on our website, steergroup.com. It's also worth noting that these recordings will be subtitled. As we're talking, you'll be able to use the comments section to share your views as the conversation goes on. However, given the condensed format of these events, we won't be able to respond to these comments live, but Toby and I will review your questions and comments and come back to you after the event as appropriate. So let's get going. To set the scene, following a changing landscape in terms of electric vehicle policy and timelines, we're here today to talk about electric vehicles and infrastructure in the UK and how this sector might evolve under a Labour government. So to set the scene, in recent years we've seen strong electric vehicle adoption in the UK, and this has been driven in particular by vehicles sold through fleets. We've seen a background of changing government policy in terms of ending the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles. The Labour manifesto pledged to reinstate the 2030 ban on the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles, in particular cars. So, Toby, welcoming you to this series. Against the landscape that I've outlined, I'd like to explore your views on a number of questions. And the first of these is really to get your kind of view on electric vehicle adoption levels and what you think the sort of current trends are, particularly in fleets. And I guess as we talk, it'd be interesting to see whether that differs by vehicles that are leased or rented, and then maybe touch a little bit on the difference between cars and light commercial vehicles.
Sure. So I think first thing to say is we've come a long way, and it's very, if you look at the sort of macro figures, it's easy to say that, we've done a great job so far. You can point to the fact that there's over 1 million EVs now on the roads. We're probably fast approaching, if not just gone past 65,000 public charge points available. And we've got a really strong policy environment, particularly with the ZEV mandate and the high profile phase out target that really help direct everybody involved in road transport towards clear targets and timelines. So from that point of view, things are going pretty well. I'd say probably the one sector that hasn't come to the party yet, really, and this is what's causing concern, is that private or retail demand for electric vehicles. So if you counterpoise it against the business corporate fleet side and the retail, that's the one that's really lacking. And the unfortunate side effect of that is a really, really imbalanced transition. And obviously that imbalance gets much more important as we head towards those big targets, and as the EV fleet across the whole UK grows, and we need to meet the needs of millions and millions and millions of EV drivers. So to maybe give you a bit of illustration of what that imbalance looks like, if you look at corporate fleets in terms of the percentage that is battery electric, it's up towards, in terms of registrations, it's up towards sort of 40% plus now.
Right.
Is electric. When you can compare that to private registrations, it's probably in single figure percentages. If you look at the rental market, again, the car rental fleet is at around 4%. And then if you look at the another example of the imbalance is the used market, where we've seen a 50% fall in the value of used BEVs over the past 2 years, whereas ICE vehicles have sort of held their value pretty well. Other examples are with dealers, who obviously play such an important role in selling BEVs. you've got about 80+% of franchise dealers are actively selling new and used BEVs, whereas it's way below 20% for independent dealers.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then the final imbalance, I'd say, is a probably a more of a less based on numbers, but just the fact that the product that's out there, unfortunately, we're in a situation where battery electric cars and vans cost a lot to manufacture, and the
Mhm.
profit margins are much tighter, which means that unfortunately they're sort of a lot of the vehicles that are available, battery electric vehicles that are available from manufacturers, are priced more expensive than what a consumer is intending to
Mhm.
spend. So there's an
Mhm.
imbalance there in terms of what's available and what people are looking for. So
Yeah.
these are all some of the things we have to tackle and sort of reduce that.
Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is that if you look at the aggregate statistics on vehicles that are being registered, it actually hides a real difference there between those vehicles that are being added to fleets and those that are going to the private market.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what the government has done well has sort of worked with the business sector, which makes rational cost-based decisions. So it's used the right levers, and it's got a long track record of using those levers, those tax
Mhm.
incentives, or the sort of more stick side of the tax regime. And it knows that companies, fleets will respond to that very quickly, and they've produced strong incentives in the form of the benefit in kind
Mhm.
regime,
Mhm.
and that has turbocharged adoption. But I think what we're beginning to see now is people just say, well, hang on, it's no good just relying on one sector
Mhm.
of industry to sort of bear all the burden of that transition. You have to have a broad base to have a strong sort of transition going forward.
I guess it's quite interesting because you mentioned there about the decline in battery electric vehicle second-hand values. Do you think there's actually there a kind of an upside to that for the private consumer in that many private consumers aren't buying new and they are actually accessing the second-hand market? I know a couple of years ago, the complaint from the consumer side was that the second-hand supply of battery electric vehicles wasn't there. So is there a kind of a cyclical thing where actually that second-hand supply and the drop in values is not great for the fleet market, but actually it starts to mean that the private market can pick up again?
Absolutely. So this is one of the complexities you get when you try and talk about the used market, because
Mm,
it obviously impacts lots of different players. There's lots of people involved. First thing to say is it's massive.
yeah.
80% of vehicles sold each year,
Mhm.
sorry, bought each year are
Yep.
used.
Yep. Yep.
So it's a very important market. You're dead right. There's probably never been a better time to buy a
Mhm.
used EV. The
Mhm.
problem is when you look aside from that sort of consumer perspective,
Mm.
there's been a 50% fall in those values over
Right.
2 years. So
Yeah.
that volatility, that depreciation has a number of effects. The first one is it scares dealers into thinking,
Mhm.
I can't go and wholesale buy a load of used BEVs, because
Mhm.
no sooner will I have them on my forecourt, they'll be losing money every day.
Yeah.
So it means they don't want to sell them, which is why
Yeah.
I think that figure of dealers selling them is so low.
Mhm. Mhm.
The other thing is that someone has to cover the cost of that depreciation. If that electric car over the course of a typical lease, let's say 4 years, is losing say 40% of its value, or if
Mhm.
50% of its value, um, a lot more than you thought,
Yeah.
that depreciation has to be priced in going forward into the new lease rate. Most people now buy their cars on finance, so they're
Absolutely.
not
Yeah.
used to paying a bulk amount, they're used to paying a
Yeah.
monthly fee. So the impact is going to be one, that people are just wary of the market because it's
Mhm.
volatile, and so they won't sell it, and it won't develop that way. You won't have a
Mhm.
range of choice. The other one is the huge depreciation will have to be paid for somewhere, and it will end up going on new lease rates,
Sure.
and that just prices out a whole new generation of people from getting on board there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's our main concerns.
That's it. Yeah. So let's think about the positives. So you talked a little bit about this, but what do you think is working well to encourage EV adoption in the UK?
I think a nice simple way of looking at this is probably to think of it as a hearts and minds. Most people fall
Mhm.
into one of those buckets in terms of whether they're going to transition to zero emission. And I think there's pluses and minuses on both sides. I think on the heart side, I think that million represents a very good job done with all those people that probably didn't need a lot of convincing that they wanted
Mhm.
to go green. They see the big picture. They like the idea of their transport not having any carbon emissions or very limited from the tailpipe, zero from the tailpipe, and they've obviously bought into that. I think on that side, I think you've got to say that also there's a significant portion of people on the sort of emotional side who are never going to buy an electric vehicle in the short term. You know, they are just so pro combustion. They're probably, you know, climate change deniers. Don't think any of this is happening. So they are always going to be maybe the sort that you need to leave for later. You know, you need
a relatively small chunk of the market.
I hope so. Yeah, I think they're probably the ones that are going to need a stick rather than a carrot, and they're, you know, and then there's probably there's probably quite a lot in the middle, right? And I think they are one of the challenging areas now where there's probably a combination of factors that are going to get them over the line. You know, there's probably unfortunately a few who are maybe too trusting in some of the media, who've got this sort of slightly negative slant, particularly some of the press, in terms of these false myths around, you know, electric vehicles crashing through car park roofs or catching fire. I think things like that, which have all been debunked by the people that know, and also maybe other people who are sort of just keeping an eye on the public charging provision and saying, until I see a nice shiny big range of public charging near me, maybe I won't do it. So I think we're sort of not bad there, but there's obviously some stuff to work on. When you look at the mines piece, again, I think there's a case of some successes and some more challenges. If you look at the corporate market, company cars, particularly salary sacrifice, benefit in kind has been a game changer. You know, it has driven probably 70-80% of all BEVs are going in that direction, because it is such a no-brainer. And I think the other area where we need to change that is obviously on the retail buyer or the private buyer who looks at the price gap between a electric car, a battery electric car, and an ICE vehicle, looks at the cost of public charging, particularly if you want to do ultra rapid charging, where it's way ahead of the cost of diesel or petrol, and just says, no, it doesn't really work for me at the moment. You know, you want these people to feel like money saving expert Martin Lewis when they choose a car, that they want to feel a bit smug and a bit like, you know, look at what they're the same sort of people that go on that tariff and tell you when they meet you that they're saving, you know, loads of money on tariff, and why aren't you doing that? That sort of approach, you want them to feel clever. And on the retail side, yet there's not enough of that picture to be able to seduce those people in and make them feel like they're doing a clever thing.
I guess there's a bit of a, as you say, it's a kind of logical information. I mean, the reality is if people are able to access home charging, and you know a reasonably good proportion of people with off-street parking driveways, if the understanding the differential in cost there, that actually if they're doing most of their charging at home, then actually there is a, you know, in terms of fuel, a cost saving there.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think we've probably got most of those people. Unless they've got just a real aversion to it, or they've got slightly strange travel habits, or huge families, or you know, 5 dogs maybe. I don't know, but I think we've probably got most of those people. You're right.
Sure. Yeah. So the new Labour government has pledged to reinstate the 2030 internal combustion engine sales ban. The actual detail of what this will involve is limited at the moment, and there's some sort of commentary in the press as to, you know, whether this is cars, is this like commercial vehicles, you know, is this does this include plug-in hybrids? So be interested to get your thoughts on this. And actually, you know, it turned out when the date was rolled back to 2035, it didn't actually make a lot of difference. And so I'm wondering if we're now returning to the 2030 date. It's probably worth for some of our listeners explaining a little bit about what that means, and then what impact you think those changes in dates might have.
Yeah, so I think the phase out can be seen. You could argue it's a slight red herring in that it is not legislation. It is not forcing anyone to. Obviously, it sets a target, an aspiration, but there's nothing imminently today that it makes people do. I think it does send a very important sort of PR message or communications message, an indicator to the market. And anecdotally, I've definitely heard people say that when the phase out was pushed back end of last year in the autumn, it did result in a drop off in that retail demand. There was certainly a cadre of people that thought, I've got an extra 5 years. Do you know what? I was feeling a little bit nervous. I'm not going to worry about it now. in terms of Labour's strategy of bringing it back, we've actually polled our members on this, and they're pretty. They've got a diverse range of opinions. I think there's some, probably
Okay.
depending on where they sit in the market and
Yeah.
what their share of BEV fleet, electric car fleet is. Some feel that it would be a useful statement to inspire confidence again, that you do need to get on with it and make the transition. But there's quite a few others who feel that this flip-flopping between 2030, 2035, another change of position just adds to that uncertainty and that feeling that government really hasn't got an idea or a plan, and it's not being stuck to, and you risk doing something that could be undone by what the government's doing. So that being said, I don't think it's a major game changer, depending on what Labour does. On that topic, obviously, it's worth remembering that there is a car aspect and a van aspect.
Yes,
And
indeed.
I think Labour's being much more noisy about the car side. I think the van side, I think everybody is a bit more concerned about the van transition, and probably it's harder to argue that the van transition is going to plan, and that I think maybe Labour will be a little bit more cautious about moving the van transition, because the van market really is stuck in the doldrums. It's actually
let's
getting
dig into
worse.
that. Let's dig into that a little bit, because the majority of vans are they're commercial vehicles. They're used for commercial purposes. And if you live in or spend time in a major city, you will see an increase in electric vans being run by major delivery firms and so on. But I suppose that is not a complete picture of the fleet, is it? Because there's an awful lot of vans which are kind of single, businesses that just have the one vehicle. So how does that affect the dynamic of that industry?
So to give you the macro, I'll give you the overall view of what's happening first, and that is that the van transition is really struggling. So we're actually having fewer registrations as a percentage of fewer electric van registrations as a percentage of all registrations this year compared to last year.
Interesting.
In terms of the shape, I think yes, you had some early adopters, particularly people in organizations or firms in sort of big cities, maybe who had zero emission zones or other sort of restrictions. But the vast majority of those electric vans have been going to the big blue chip fleets, who are fleets that actually probably put a bit more of a premium on doing the right thing. They might have a certain ESG strategy or a carbon reduction plan, or just really want to be seen to be doing the right thing. And they're able to quite often make decisions based on that, rather than what most fleets will look at, which is pure cost of ownership. How much is this van going to cost me, this electric van, compared to a diesel van? Can it do the same things? And will my drivers accept it? Will it require too many compromises? And unfortunately, on all three of those areas, there's a significant portion of the standard van fleet that are finding issues. They're finding issues with the cost of the vans being too expensive. They're finding issues, particularly around charging infrastructure, where if you think about a lot of van drivers take their vans home with the evening, quite a few of them don't have off-street parking, and just accessibility of vans to a lot of charge points. They can't fit them in, and quite often you get negative responses from local residents if they see vans parked in what they assume is like a personal private charge point. There's other issues such as bookability. Again, if you can imagine, if you're a van fleet operator and you've got a schedule of 7 or 8 appointments that day where you might be servicing a boiler or dropping stuff off, the ability to book and plan your charging around that is essential. And there's nothing a driver hates worse than having to sort of clock on early or finish late because something's gone awry then. And then finally, it's the issue of what was called weight derogations, which is where, because of the weight of the battery, for those heavy duty, large sort of 3 ton above vans, the government gave a special derogation that they could actually be driven by Joe Public without a commercial vehicle license up to 4.25 tons, which is great. But what they didn't do is change the operator licensing regime, which means that people driving one of those heavier electric vans still have to abide by certain heavy goods vehicle operating regimes. So they have to have them MOT'd once a year, and they have to even have restrictions on how long they can drive them. which
Right.
again for an average van driver, it's just they just don't
Doesn't make
want that
sense.
hassle.
Yeah, that makes sense. So this is, you're kind of linking to my next question, which is about electric vehicle infrastructure. So having sufficient, reliable public EV infrastructure is vital support to support the growth of electric vehicles. Maybe if you take a little bit of a step back, and I know you've got some personal international experience here, how do you think we're doing in the UK?
I actually, this is a very personal issue, right? So this,
Mhm.
from my experience, this can depend on your last motorway journey or your
Sure.
last holiday and what happened to you. But
Mhm.
I actually feel quite positive about this. Looking at the
Mhm.
numbers, I think we've done a great job of, and the charge point operators are doing a great job of putting their money out there in advance, trying to
Mhm.
maintain um, the speed of rollout of infrastructure with the registrations growth. So I think we're at about 65,000 charge points now. We added 18,000 charge points last year.
Mhm.
Um, and personally, just from my travels up and down the motorways, I used to
Mhm.
have sort of no-go zones like, the M1
Yeah, can't go there.
or
Yeah.
sort of the M6 north of Birmingham, or
Mhm.
latter edges of the roads down to Devon and Cornwall. I'm finding it now increasingly easy, almost to the stage where I don't have to plan my route
Yeah.
on those trips. Same when I go abroad. Again, most of my experience is in sort of France and Corsica,
Mhm.
where I've had two vacations and lots of driving, and it was absolutely fine. But I do appreciate that can vary. You can have, particularly on bank holidays and
Yeah.
peak travel periods, you can have issues. And obviously, when your car is packed with, you know, uh, as mine has been in the past, with all your extended family and a pet
Mm.
and a roof
Mm.
box, and you're on a
Mhm.
deadline, there can be stresses. But I think it is getting better, and probably better than a lot of people um, expected. I remember having a chat with a charge point operator probably about 2 years ago, who told me things are going to get worse before they got better. And I haven't caught up with him recently, but actually, I don't think they got worse. I think they've
Mm.
continued to get better. The one area I would say probably where I'm a little bit concerned is in the breakdown of public charging, because public charging
Okay.
can be very, very different. It varies from your ultra fast Ionity, you know,
Mhm.
350 kilowatt charger
Mhm.
that will charge your car from 20% to 80% in 25, 30
Mhm.
minutes.
Mhm.
But you'll pay for it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and there's lots of those. I mean, there's a huge big rollout of those. They're, if you like, the sexier charge points. They're probably
Mm.
also the ones that
Mm.
earn more money,
Yeah.
and maybe
Absolutely.
the easier ones to get planning permission
Mhm.
and to
Mhm.
put in, right the way down to some of the smaller um, slow or sort of slower fast chargers that are mainly giving that sort of 7 kilowatt, 22 kilowatt.
Mhm.
And they're the sort of ones that people will rely on day to day. They're the sort of
Yeah.
charge points
Yeah.
that your van driver taking their van home for the evening, um, or someone traveling out to the country somewhere will rely on to do maybe an overnight charge, or just top up for a couple of hours. And the rollout of those is slower, and it
Yeah.
also is a bit more complicated because quite often it involves local authorities. I mean, we're in a scenario where we've got this much publicised Levi fund,
Mm.
which has got a big pot of money from government to sort of invest with local authorities in rolling out public infrastructure. And quelle surprise, when local authorities knew that this money was available, they stopped any other plans they had and waited for
Yeah.
this
It's a
money
sort
to
of
trickle
hiatus.
through.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's beginning to trickle through, and we thought there was a green light, but then I've just heard recently that there may be some legal concerns, as there always are with any big
Yes.
expensive procurement program, and that's holding things up. So again, that's a concern. As I just said, that bit is one bit we really do need to accelerate.
Yeah, no, I know. I have heard of these legal concerns, and indeed, some colleagues have been trying to work through that. So yeah, it's a
Fingers
challenge.
crossed.
Yeah, just personally, I think some of the things, it's great that the charging network is improving and that the reliability is improving, but there are some joined up things that aren't necessarily that thought through. I stopped to charge at a rapid charging station that was at Park and Ride, which had a toilet facilities, and it was all excellent. Apart from it was a Sunday, so there were no Park and Ride facilities, so the toilets weren't available. So just simple things about thinking through.
Yeah.
These are 24/7 facilities, and therefore they need to be designed that way. So we're coming towards the end, but I've got a couple of more questions I'd like to squeeze in. The next one, be interested to see your thoughts on this. So there's been a rise in Chinese manufacturers, which are sort of adding competition to more established manufacturers and also sort of offering a breadth of different vehicles. And this has led to, both in Europe, sort of mainland Europe, the European Commission, and also in the United States in terms of high import tariffs. Is this beneficial to the market? I think in the UK, we've got a bit of a sort of a status quo type approach at the moment, but it's kind of subject to change. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's a tricky one. On the plus side, there are some, Chinese manufacturers have leapfrogged European and US manufacturers in terms of they were probably way behind in terms of combustion engine technology.
Mm-hmm.
So they haven't tried to compete on that level. They've leapfrogged, and they are producing some fantastically fantastic performance, very high quality electric vehicles. For the most part, these vehicles are just as much, if not better quality than some of their European and American counterparts, and they can do it much cheaper. So you can't argue against the fact that we need more affordable electric vehicles, particularly at certain price points. That entry level, sort of urban runaround small car, the ones that a lot of other manufacturers can't afford to make because they can't make any profit. We need those cars in the UK desperately. So on the one hand, I think that's good. We also need I think everyone wants a domestic UK automotive industry and supply chain to survive. We want breadth of choice. And tariffs are never good for anybody, any market. So I guess I want my cake and eat it. I want the Chinese product, but I want to look after our domestic market and have plenty of choice.
A balanced approach. Yeah. Great. Well, I've got one last question for you, and this is: if you can encourage the new incoming government to do one thing to improve electric vehicle take-up, what would it be?
So the big one for me, we've talked about the phase-out target. So I said that's a bit of a red herring, and that's a bit of a red herring because we have this thing called the zero emission vehicle mandate, which is a real sort of UK first here in terms of policy that the government introduced. It's enshrined in legislation, and this mandate sets targets for manufacturers who bring vehicles into the UK, the proportion of zero emission vehicles they sell from now to 2030. So it rises from 22% of cars need to be zero emission this year, 10% of vans, that rises to 80% and 70% by 2030. And it's having a massive impact on the market in terms of OEM strategies, in terms of vehicles that fleets and that are being offered, the level of discounting. It's having an enormous effect on the whole market. It's a brand new way of operating, and I would say to the government, you need to review the impact of this. You need to sit down and just assess what sort of impact it's having on the market, and I think that will raise a few concerns to them. As I just said, it will raise concerns around the fact that the retail market isn't really working properly at the moment. We need to address that. It will raise concerns, as it does, about the van market. And the used market, and it will also raise concerns around shared mobility, where a big part of that ZEV mandate is as a special credit to incentivize vehicles going to shared use car club vehicles. Car club market is too small in the UK, so that isn't having an impact. There's probably, I don't know, 6,000-7,000 car clubs, and you probably got more accurate figure than me. But we've got 250,000 other shared use vehicles that are called rental vehicles, car rental, and we think they could really bring electric vehicles to the masses, really democratize it if they had access to the same credits, because at the moment the sums don't add up for the rental sector. So I'd say review it, and then you're going to spot these few things that you need to tweak with incentives, with grants, with regulation, and it can all be done very quickly.
Yeah, so that's a good summary. So effectively, understand the current situation, but actually with a few tweaks, the market could be made to function better with benefits on both sides. Toby, that's been really great talking to you today, and thanks very much for sparing some time to discuss your insights. Also, thanks to our audience for joining. Toby, before we close, I wondered if you'd like to tell us a little bit about your Road to Zero report you've recently published, which our viewers might be interested in.
Yes, so you've probably heard me quote a few stats today about the market And there are these stats and dozens of others in our Road to Zero report card that we published the 2024 edition of a couple of weeks ago. This is our 6th version of that report now. And we use it basically to track that journey to zero emissions. So we look at all aspects of the market: cars, vans, trucks, all, whether it's business use, rental, retail and private use, the used market, the ZEV mandate. If you want to know what's going on in road transport decarbonisation, just use your phone or your tablet, use that QR code, and it's a really accessible piece of web research you can scroll through. No big downloads or anything. And yeah, please take a look and let us know what you think.
Great, thanks very much, Toby. So we have further sessions planned for the coming weeks on topics including economic policy, transport policy, and more. If you haven't signed up to those, please do visit our website. The next session will be taking place next Tuesday at 10:30 a.m. The topic is economic policy and the government's priorities for regional and national growth. My colleague Josh Stott from Steer Economic Development will be speaking to Claire Haywood, MBE. She's the chair of NP11, which is an organisation focused on driving economic prosperity in the north. She's also the chair of the Cheshire and Warrington Local Economic Partnership. With that, it's a goodbye from Toby and I. Thanks very much all.